It was a bright morning when Sandra, a young woman, arrived at the bustling airport, ready for her long-awaited vacation. She was excited to board her flight, as it was a much-needed break after months of hard work. The excitement in the air was contagious, with families, friends, and solo travelers all hurrying to their gates, ready to begin their journeys. Sandra couldn't help but smile as she looked at the boarding pass in her hand, the thought of her destination filling her with joy. As she waited in line to board the plane, Sandra overheard a conversation between two airline crew members standing near the gate. One was a man who looked to be in his mid-30s, dressed in the uniform of a pilot. The other was a woman, likely a flight attendant, who was talking about their upcoming shift. Sandra was caught off guard when she heard the pilot make a comment that seemed out of place. "Can you believe who we're flying today?" he said, his voice low enough that Sandra had to lean in a bit to hear him clearly. "This flight is going to be full of trouble. I just know it." Sandra's heart skipped a beat as she realized he was referring to the passengers, but it was the way he spoke, his tone, the slight sneer, that bothered her. She didn't know exactly who he was talking about, but the implication was clear. There was a hint of discomfort in the air, as if he wasn't exactly happy with the passengers he was going to serve today. Sandra tried to shake off the thought, convincing herself that it was just an offhand remark, but the feeling lingered in the back of her mind. A few minutes later, Sandra found herself at the boarding gate, waiting to board her flight. She had almost forgotten about the pilot's words when she was called forward to board the plane. As she entered the jet bridge and walked toward the plane, she glanced up and saw the same pilot. He was standing near the cockpit, chatting with a crew member. Sandra quickly looked away, not wanting to make eye contact, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made her uneasy. It wasn't a normal polite glance. It was almost as if he was sizing her up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As she stepped onto the plane, Sandra tried to put her worries aside. She greeted the flight attendants with a smile, took her seat by the window, and started to settle in for the flight, but something kept gnawing at her. Every time she looked up, she noticed the pilot. He was walking through the aisles, glancing over at her. His eyes seemed to linger a bit too long, and Sandra's stomach twisted with a mixture of confusion and concern. She tried to ignore it, telling herself she was overthinking things, but the longer she sat in her seat, the more she began to feel uncomfortable. Sandra had always been one to brush off minor annoyances, but this time, something about the situation felt different. The pilot's attitude, his strange behavior, was something she couldn't ignore. Sandra decided to stay calm, telling herself she would just get through the flight and focus on the vacation that awaited her. But little did she know, the situation was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would change everything. This should create the suspense and keep the audience interested. Let me know if you'd like me to continue or adjust anything. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Sandra settled back in her seat, trying to relax and enjoy the flight. The gentle hum of the engines filled the cabin, and the seatbelt sign blinked on, signaling that everyone should stay seated. Sandra glanced out the window, taking in the view of the airport shrinking below them. It should have been the peaceful start to her vacation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few minutes into the flight, the pilot's voice came over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," he said, his voice calm and professional, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with Sandra. His tone was flat, almost distant, and it reminded her of the way he had spoken earlier. She tried to brush it off, reminding herself that maybe it was just her imagination. However, as the flight continued, things started to feel strange. Sandra had noticed that the flight attendants were treating the pilot with a bit more distance than usual. They seemed a little more tense around him, offering polite but brief exchanges as they moved through the aisles. Sandra couldn't help but wonder if they too felt that something was wrong, but they remained professional, continuing their duties. As she reached for the small in-flight magazine in the seat pocket in front of her, Sandra caught sight of the pilot once again. He was walking down the aisle, his gaze briefly meeting hers. This time, there was no mistaking the discomfort she felt. His eyes held a certain coldness, as if they were looking past her and judging her at the same time. Sandra's heart skipped a beat, and she quickly looked away, focusing on the magazine in her hands. But it wasn't just the look that unsettled her. As the pilot continued walking past the rows of seats, Sandra couldn't help but notice that he was purposely avoiding eye contact with other passengers. Except for her, it felt as though he was waiting for something, perhaps to see if she would make a move or say something. But Sandra was too stunned to react. She simply kept her eyes on the magazine, feeling her hands begin to tremble slightly. It wasn't until the seatbelt sign went off, signaling that they had reached cruising altitude, that Sandra allowed herself to relax a little. She took a deep breath and glanced around at the other passengers, hoping to find some sense of normalcy. Everyone seemed calm and content, but Sandra couldn't shake the growing feeling of being watched. The pilot's behavior had been strange enough, but it was the way he kept directing his attention toward her that troubled her the most. She wasn't sure what it meant, but something told her that his actions were not just a coincidence. She wondered if anyone else had noticed the tension, or if it was just her. Just as she was about to let her guard down, Sandra heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching again. This time, the pilot stopped right next to her seat. She felt her heart rate quicken as his presence loomed overhead. Without saying a word, he gave her a glance, one that was even more uncomfortable than the others. Sandra quickly turned her gaze forward, unsure of how to handle the situation. She hoped this would be the last time their paths crossed. This version of Part 2 should keep the reader engaged and heighten the suspense as the pilot's strange behavior continues. Let me know if you'd like me to make any adjustments. As Sandra sat in her seat, the unease in her chest continued to grow. She couldn't stop thinking about the pilot's strange behavior. Every time she glanced in his direction, she saw him watching her, almost as if he was waiting for something. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but it was impossible to ignore. The longer the flight went on, the more uncomfortable she became. It wasn't until she took out her phone and called her husband, Marcus, that she could finally express her concerns. She had been trying to hold it together, not wanting to make a scene, but she couldn't stop thinking about the situation. Marcus had been waiting for her call, and when he picked up, he could immediately tell something was wrong. "Sandra, is everything okay?" Marcus's voice was full of concern. Sandra could hear the tension in his tone as he asked, knowing that something wasn't right. Sandra hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain everything without sounding paranoid, but she knew she needed to tell him. "Marcus, something's not right on this flight. I don't know how to explain it, but the pilot, he's been acting strange," she said, her voice filled with a mix of frustration and confusion. "He keeps looking at me, like he's judging me, and it's making me really uncomfortable." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Marcus spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Sandra, I want you to stay calm. I'm going to come down to the airport right now. I don't like what I'm hearing, and I'll handle it. Don't worry, okay?" Sandra felt a wave of relief wash over her as Marcus's reassuring words soothed her nerves. She knew he would come through for her, just as he always had. She ended the call and sat back in her seat, trying to collect herself. Her husband was on his way, and she felt a small sense of comfort knowing he would take charge of the situation. As the plane continued its journey, Sandra glanced nervously at the pilot's cockpit. She could see the pilot walking through the aisles, but this time, he didn't glance at her. Instead, he appeared to be focused on his duties, which gave Sandra a moment of peace. Maybe it was just her imagination, after all. But that peace didn't last long. As the flight progressed, Sandra began to notice that the other passengers weren't acting quite like they usually would. They seemed more withdrawn, quieter than usual, as though the pilot's presence was affecting everyone on the plane. Sandra couldn't be sure, but the silence around her was unnerving. When Marcus arrived at the airport, he immediately made his way to the terminal. He had been on edge ever since Sandra told him about the pilot's behavior. He didn't like the idea of his wife feeling uncomfortable or unsafe, and he certainly wasn't going to let the situation go unchecked. As soon as he stepped into the airport, he started looking for any sign of trouble, his mind already racing with the possibilities. This version of Part 3 continues to build tension and suspense as Marcus prepares to take action. Let me know if you'd like me to modify anything or continue with the next part. Marcus was determined to get to the bottom of the situation. As soon as he arrived at the airport, he made his way toward the gate where Sandra's flight was scheduled. His mind raced with concern. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and he wasn't about to let his wife go through this alone. He had always been the one to protect her, and today would be no different. As Marcus walked through the terminal, he spotted the gate for Sandra's flight. He could see the other passengers lined up, preparing to board the next leg of the journey. The whole area seemed calm, but there was a tension in the air that he couldn't ignore. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking for Sandra. When he finally spotted her, seated in a row of chairs, she looked out the window, lost in thought. Her face was tense, and he could tell she was still shaken up by what she had told him on the phone. He approached her carefully, wanting to avoid drawing attention. As he got closer, Sandra looked up, her face lighting up with relief when she saw him. She stood up quickly and gave him a small, grateful smile, but her eyes were filled with worry. "Marcus, thank you for coming," she said softly. Her voice had an edge of anxiety, but she seemed glad to see him. "I don't know what's going on, but I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong. The pilot, it's like he's watching me." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to remain calm for her. He knew this wasn't something to be taken lightly. His protective instincts kicked in as he put his hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Sandra. We'll handle this together. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." With that, Marcus walked over to the boarding area, where the pilot had been earlier. He scanned the room and saw the pilot standing near the cockpit door, chatting with a flight attendant. There was something about the way the pilot was standing, too stiff, almost defensive, that caught Marcus's attention. He knew that he had to confront the man directly. Marcus approached the pilot slowly, trying to keep his movements calm and composed. When the pilot saw him approaching, his expression shifted slightly, but he didn't move. Marcus took a deep breath before speaking. "Excuse me, are you the pilot on this flight?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but firm. The pilot glanced at him for a moment before responding with a polite, almost rehearsed smile. "Yes, I am. Can I help you?" Marcus didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "My wife, Sandra, is on this flight, and she's been feeling uncomfortable because of the way you've been acting toward her," he said, his tone even but sharp. "I want to know why you're treating her like this. Is there something wrong?" The pilot's smile faltered, and he shifted uncomfortably on his feet. For a brief moment, Marcus saw a flicker of something in the man's eyes, something he couldn't quite place, but it was enough to raise his suspicion even further. "I'm not sure what you mean," the pilot replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus wasn't buying it. He stood his ground, refusing to let the pilot brush off the situation. "I don't think this is a misunderstanding. You've made my wife feel unsafe, and I won't let it go any further. I need you to explain yourself now." The pilot hesitated, his gaze darting around the room as though looking for an escape. Marcus stood tall, his eyes locked on the man, not willing to let him slip away. The tension in the air was thick, and Sandra watched from a distance, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. This version of Part 4 intensifies the confrontation as Marcus takes charge of the situation. Let me know if you'd like me to continue or make any adjustments. The pilot shifted uneasily, his confidence starting to crumble under Marcus's unwavering gaze. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the low hum of the airport's background noise. Marcus could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some curious, some uncomfortable, but he didn't care. This wasn't just about his wife anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. Finally, the pilot spoke, though his voice was strained. "I don't know what you're accusing me of," he said, his words coming out almost in a defensive whisper. "There's been a misunderstanding. I treat all passengers with respect." Marcus could tell the man's words were empty, and his patience was wearing thin. "Look, I'm not here for an argument," Marcus said firmly. "You've made my wife feel uncomfortable, and that's something I won't stand for. You don't get to make her feel that way, especially on a flight she was looking forward to." The pilot's expression tightened, but before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Sandra's eyes flicked toward the source of the sound, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw a few airport security officers approaching. It seemed they had been alerted to the tension and were coming to see what was happening. One of the security officers, a tall man with a serious face, walked up to the group. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. He looked at Marcus first, then turned his gaze to the pilot. It was clear that the officers had been called to handle any situation that was escalating, but they weren't yet aware of the full details. Marcus stepped forward, standing a little taller. "This man has been treating my wife in a way that's unacceptable," he said, not holding back. "He's been acting strange toward her, making her feel unsafe. I want this addressed now." The pilot, now visibly flustered, tried to compose himself, but the cracks in his calm facade were evident. "That's not true," he said quickly, his words coming out in a rush. "I have nothing against her. There's been some misunderstanding here." The security officer turned to the flight attendants, who had gathered nearby, looking uncertain about how to proceed. They exchanged glances before one of them finally spoke up, her voice hesitant but clear. "We've noticed the tension as well," she said, her eyes darting nervously from the pilot to Marcus. "We've been trying to maintain order, but we were concerned when he seemed to focus only on her." Marcus's heart sank. Hearing the flight attendants confirm what he had already feared made everything feel even more real. The pilot had been acting out of line, and now it was clear that he hadn't just been making Sandra feel uncomfortable. He had been behaving suspiciously, with the intent to make her feel singled out. The security officer nodded thoughtfully, then addressed the pilot. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment. We're going to look into this further." The officer's tone left no room for argument, and the pilot's face paled as he took a step back, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. The other passengers watched in silence as the tension grew even thicker. Sandra, who had been watching the exchange from a distance, felt a mixture of relief and frustration. She was relieved that her husband had stood up for her, but she also couldn't believe the whole situation had escalated so quickly. She hadn't imagined it. It had been real, and now the pilot was going to face the consequences of his actions. This version of Part 5 ramps up the tension as the situation is taken seriously by the authorities. Let me know if you'd like me to continue or make any adjustments. As the security officer guided the pilot away from the crowd, Sandra couldn't help but feel a sense of both relief and unease. The tension that had built up in the air seemed to dissipate, but the situation was far from over. She watched as Marcus stood tall, his posture unwavering, as if this confrontation was nothing more than a necessary step to make things right. The airport security officer motioned for the flight attendants to step aside, allowing them to speak privately. Sandra listened intently, her heart still racing, as she overheard fragments of their conversation. The officers were taking the matter seriously. They asked the pilot questions about his behavior, and although the pilot tried to justify his actions, Sandra could hear the uncertainty in his voice. There was no denying the discomfort he had caused her, and now the situation had escalated beyond what he had ever expected. Sandra looked at Marcus, his face calm but determined. She could see how much he cared about her, how much he wanted to make things right, and it made her feel grateful. Her mind kept replaying the moments leading up to this point. The strange glances, the uncomfortable feeling every time she was near the cockpit, the way the pilot had treated her as though she didn't belong. All of it had built up to this moment, and now it was clear that her husband's intervention had made the difference. While the conversation continued between the pilot and security, Sandra felt her anxiety slowly begin to fade. The pilot was no longer in control of the situation, and the people who were supposed to keep her safe were taking charge. It was a relief, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that this had been a deeply unsettling experience. A few minutes later, the security officer approached Marcus and Sandra, his face serious but composed. "We've reviewed the situation," he said. "After speaking with the flight attendants and gathering the necessary information, we've decided to remove the pilot from his position. He will not be operating this flight." Sandra's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. It felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, and the overwhelming feeling of fear that had gripped her was finally beginning to subside. The pilot would no longer be a threat, and the situation was finally being handled in a way that gave her a sense of closure. The security officer continued, "We're also going to make sure that the airline takes appropriate action moving forward. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated." He gave Sandra a reassuring look before turning to Marcus. "Thank you for your patience, sir. You did the right thing by stepping in." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you for taking care of this," he said. "No one should feel unsafe, especially when they're just trying to travel." Sandra glanced at Marcus, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and relief. He had been her rock through the entire ordeal, and she was so thankful that he had stepped in when she felt helpless. The thought of what could have happened if he hadn't arrived made her shudder, but now it was clear that everything was going to be all right. As the pilot was escorted away, Sandra and Marcus stood together, quietly processing what had just transpired. The rest of the passengers were still unaware of the full details, and Sandra felt a sense of calm return to her as the weight of the situation finally started to lift. She knew the flight was far from over, but now she could focus on the journey ahead, feeling more secure than she had all day. This version of Part 6 emphasizes the resolution of the conflict and offers a sense of closure and relief for Sandra and Marcus. Let me know if you'd like me to continue or make any adjustments. As the flight continued, Sandra could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had lingered for so long was finally gone, replaced by a sense of calm. It was hard to believe that just a short while ago, she had been feeling so unsafe, so uncomfortable. Now, as she sat beside Marcus, the world around her seemed a little brighter, a little more secure. The other passengers were blissfully unaware of the drama that had unfolded behind the scenes. Most of them were settling in for the flight, some reading, others chatting quietly. Sandra couldn't help but wonder if any of them had noticed the pilot's strange behavior, or if it was just something that had been confined to her experience. She still couldn't understand what had driven him to act the way he did, but at least now it was behind her. Marcus, ever the calm and collected presence beside her, gave her a reassuring smile. He knew how shaken she had been, and he could see the lingering traces of anxiety on her face. "You did great," he said, his voice soft. "I'm so proud of you for not letting it go. No one should ever make you feel the way that pilot did." Sandra smiled back at him, grateful for his words. She hadn't been sure what to do in the moment, but Marcus had given her the strength to speak up, to stand her ground. She had been scared, but knowing that he was there with her had made all the difference. "I'm just glad it's over," she said, her voice steady now. "I don't know what I would have done without you." As the flight progressed, the crew made an announcement over the intercom, informing everyone that there would be a slight delay in the schedule, but nothing major. Sandra and Marcus barely paid attention to the update. For them, the delay didn't matter as much as the fact that the issue had been resolved, and they could move forward without further incident. Soon after, a flight attendant walked down the aisle, checking in on passengers. She stopped briefly by Sandra and Marcus's seats. "I just wanted to thank you both for your patience and for bringing the situation to our attention," she said with a warm smile. "We take these matters very seriously, and we're grateful that you were able to step in before things escalated further." Sandra nodded, grateful for the kind words. "Thank you for handling everything so quickly," she said. "It means a lot to know that the airline is taking this seriously." The flight attendant gave her a nod before moving on to check on other passengers, leaving Sandra and Marcus to their quiet conversation. As they spoke, Sandra began to reflect on the events of the day. It hadn't been easy, but she was proud of herself for speaking up. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how important it was to stand up for what's right, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. By the time the flight was nearing its destination, Sandra felt like a weight had been lifted from her. The fear that had gripped her earlier was gone, replaced with a sense of relief and empowerment. She had faced an uncomfortable situation, but with Marcus's support, she had turned it into a positive outcome. As the plane began its descent, Sandra looked out the window, watching the landscape unfold beneath her. She was ready to start her vacation, but more importantly, she was ready to move forward, knowing that standing up for herself had made all the difference. This version of Part 7 brings closure to the emotional turmoil Sandra experienced, offering a sense of relief and strength as she moves forward. Let me know if you'd like to make any adjustments or continue with the next part. As the plane touched down at their destination, Sandra felt a sense of finality wash over her. The tension from earlier seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the excitement of what lay ahead. She glanced at Marcus, who was smiling at her, his presence a steady source of comfort throughout the ordeal. Together, they had faced an unexpected challenge and come out stronger on the other side. When they disembarked from the plane and made their way through the terminal, Sandra couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. The airport, which had seemed like a place full of unease just a few hours ago, now felt like a fresh start. Her mind drifted to the events of the day, how everything had escalated so quickly, how Marcus had stepped in when she needed him most. It was hard to believe that something so uncomfortable had turned into something empowering. They reached the baggage claim area, and as they waited for their luggage, Sandra felt a growing sense of pride. She had stood up for herself, and Marcus had been there to support her every step of the way. Together, they had made sure that the situation was handled with respect and care, and the pilot's actions had been rightfully addressed. The more Sandra thought about it, the more she realized how important it was for people to speak up when something didn't feel right. She had been uncertain at first, unsure whether it was worth confronting the pilot or even speaking to Marcus about it. But once she did, things had begun to change. She felt empowered, knowing that her voice mattered. As they collected their luggage and made their way toward the exit, Sandra and Marcus were approached by a few fellow passengers who had been on the same flight. Some of them had heard about the situation from the crew and wanted to thank Sandra for her bravery. One woman, with a kind smile, came up to her and said, "I just wanted to say thank you. It's so important that we stand up for each other, and I'm really glad you did." Sandra smiled, a sense of warmth spreading through her as she nodded in return. "Thank you," she replied. "It wasn't easy, but I'm glad it turned out the way it did. We all deserve to be treated with respect." As they left the airport and stepped out into the fresh air, Sandra felt like a new chapter of her life had begun. It wasn't just about the vacation anymore. It was about feeling empowered to face challenges head-on. She had learned a valuable lesson that day. Speaking out against injustice was never easy, but it was always worth it. The rest of their trip was filled with laughter, new experiences, and moments of joy. Sandra and Marcus had come to see this journey not just as a vacation, but as a reminder of the strength they had together and of the importance of standing up for what's right. By the end of the trip, Sandra felt more confident than ever before, knowing that she had made a difference and had faced her fears with courage. As they headed back home, Sandra looked at Marcus with a smile, her heart full of gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. I don't think I could have done it without you." Marcus reached over and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We're in this together," he said. "Always." This version of Part 8 brings the story to a satisfying conclusion, focusing on Sandra's growth and the positive impact of speaking up. Let me know if you'd like any changes or adjustments.